Date, 41 PST, post-stasis time. But that's dangerous. You shouldn't do that. The volcanoes are erupting. The springs are closed. The Ozerians were a perfectly rational species. It was hard not to be. Taking the most logical course of action was something that just happened for them. Some might think it was their communal lifestyle, with each member of the species being part of something bigger, creating a culture where breaking from the expected outcome resulted in individuals being shunned for being a danger to the rest of them. Others thought it was their XK wave sensitivity. Sure, they weren't the most attuned in the galaxy, they couldn't transmit thoughts telepathically or control objects with thought alone, but they did get a sense of what might happen in the future. It wasn't exact, as the concept of time having consequence and causality was a primitive and incorrect science, but it did mean that each member of the Ozerian species had a vague sense of what might or might not happen in the future. This meant that when the mass of volcanoes on their home planet of Patalon all started erupting at once, they were perfectly prepared and ready to deal with the natural disaster. There had been a feeling amongst the entire population that something big and bad was going to happen at some point, that the ground would split open as if hell itself was breaking into the world, covering vast cities and landscapes under metric tons of magma as the planet itself reformed. So when it did happen, they were perfectly ready. People moved calmly to the various bunkers and safe locations created for such an event, following previously practiced evacuation processes. While the Earth split open and volcanoes erupted across the face of their planet, the Ozerians were ready, managing the entire thing with a very little loss of life, although the economy would take some time to recover. Yes, I know. That's why I'd like to visit. The town of Teno was a small place, a town of normally 3,000 people high up on the rocky mountainside, mostly used as a tourist destination for the nearby hot springs. Normally being the operative word, since this was not a normal time. The air was filled with the smell of sulfur and smoke, billowing from the 3 active volcanoes visible from the mountainside's vantage point. The hundreds of meter-high eruptions of bright blue molten rock dominated the sky, while the ever-flowing rivers of lava that had destroyed countless towns stretched out into a hellish landscape below them. Teno was currently hosting over 50,000 people displaced from the local area, although this wasn't too much of an issue. This had all been long planned for, with plenty of emergency bunker space and supplies to last. The Ozerians were a perfectly rational species. All they could do was just sit and wait for it all to blow over. Well, that, and deal with the deluge of visiting Terrans. But that's dangerous! You shouldn't do that! The hot springs are closed! All 3 eyes on Latilian's head blinked repeatedly in frustration as they looked at the strange, stupid Terran that stood across from them. The raptor was around 5 feet tall, needle-sharp teeth clicking as she spoke with words full of annoyance. The feathers that covered her entire body glistened and glowed in the morning light, as they continually changed color, each one cycling through the entire light spectrum in waves of emotion and feeling, like a living kaleidoscope. She sat behind the kiosk in the small office for tourist information, the tiny building filled with now outdated data dumps about the local hot springs and other notable attractions to visit. The only other person in the room being the single male Terran standing on the other side of the desk. The Terrans were new to the galactic stage, having spent the last 40-odd years befriending and allying themselves with anyone and everyone they could find, and generally being a chaotic nuisance to everyone they met. They were plenty fine galactic neighbors, with a tendency to get themselves into trouble, and a willingness to help even when not asked. It was a well-known fact that if you were in trouble, that if some form of natural disaster was putting people in danger, the Terrans would be there to help. They'd arrive with their logistical prowess, a heart full of empathy and willingness to set stuff on fire. Apart from this time, the Ozerians didn't need any help, meaning the strange chaos primates had decided to turn up anyway just to look at stuff. Gone were the charities and humanitarian efforts, replaced instead with tourists of all things, tourists who had gone out of their way to visit the planet during this time of volcanic activity. Which made no sense to the Ozerians, since all attractions the planet had to offer were closed. The Ozerians were a perfectly rational species after all. I understand that. I'm not here for the springs. I'm here because this planet has some of the greatest geological movements happening in the local galaxy. Volcanoes and lava flows. I just need transportation, anyone who has a spare vehicle they're not using. But that's dangerous. You do realize that lava is hot, right? Latilian felt as if they were stuck in a hellish infinite loop, where the Terran would describe a desire to do something stupid and dangerous. Then the Ozerian would remind the stupid primate that it was stupid and dangerous. Technically, helping tourists was her job, but with the current natural disaster going on and how efficient the process of keeping the entire planet safe had been, the most Latilian had expected to have to do was point the occasional Ozerian towards the location of the many available supplies. She didn't expect her day to be filled with having to explain to some space lemurs that fire is hot. This one wasn't even the first one. She had spoken to no less than 4 other Terrans today, each one attempting to gain passage to get a closer look at the dangerous mass of molten rock. Like moths drawn to a flame, Terrans seemed to be drawn to situations in which they could die. Latilian could feel herself getting exasperated as the chaotic primate seemingly didn't understand the danger of the situation. Look, I get it. I know the risks. This isn't my first rodeo. If you know anyone in town who's willing to get me closer or let me borrow a vehicle, I'll pay 500 credits for a ride and sign whatever waivers you want. But that's... Latilian paused for a moment, her initial rejection of such a stupid idea being cut off by the number the Terran had given. 500 credits was a lot for such a request, and she did know a lot of people who currently had nothing else to do. Well, I might know someone. The Ozerians were a perfectly rational species. However, 500 credits was 500 credits. The aircraft crested the ridge slowly, the rocky mountainside giving way to the valley below as the full power of the geological movements were shown. Fystories could hear the gasps and exclamations of wonder from the 12 passengers he was carrying as the full power of what was happening all over the planet came into view. While the Ozerian didn't quite understand why the Terrans he was carrying were so interested in coming all this way to see the dangerous volcanic activity, they had to admit seeing the impact of the eruptions laid out below was quite some sight. The skyline was dominated by the 3 active volcanoes in the distance, the trio of peaks causing bubbling magma to be expelled high into the air, the high sulfur content causing the rock to burn a bright blue. The molten earth flowed through the land in rivers and lakes of blue fire, carving out paths in the earth and forests below. Of course, just because Fystories could understand there was a certain beauty to the absolute power of the planet they called home, didn't mean they understood why these Terrans wanted to see it up close and personal. The Ozerians were a perfectly rational species. It was the kind of sight better looked at through a photo, away from any possible danger. But these crazy primates seemed to flock toward this unique and dangerous experience for no logical reason. Not that Fystories really minded. The Terrans could put themselves in whatever danger they wanted if they were paying for it. As the aircraft he was piloting touched down upon the grassy clearing, he could see plenty of other vehicles piloted and driven by members of the local community also going to and fro. The Terrans spent money as if it was going to explode, the excitement of the volcanic eruptions causing hundreds of thousands of them to descend upon the planet. With nothing else to do but wait, a large section of the population had spent the last 3 weeks selling to the Terrans anything and everything related to the planet's volcanic activities. Trips, trinkets, even pieces of the cooled volcanic rock and its blue sulfuric sheen. Fystories watched as the Terrans he'd brought with him on this go-around rushed out of his aircraft with glee, the clumsy, derpy primates scattering off as soon as they could, making a straight line towards the lava flows with a reckless abandon. The Ozerian had long since given up trying to explain the dangers of hot molten rock, instead just letting the chaos lemurs do their thing in their excitement over dangerous geological activity. There were plenty of Terrans here, hundreds of them doing their thing, swarming around the cooling rivers of molten rock. This far away from the source, the blue lava moved at a snail's pace, steaming slightly as it made contact with the cold air, while the crazy primates of Terra did their thing. They gathered around, taking pictures with handheld devices and drones, groups of them staring and pointing. The more enterprising souls were interacting with molten rock itself, using the heat to cook food for no other reason than they could, or collecting samples using heat-resistant tools and containers. At least they were being safe, mostly. Several Terrans had asked Fystories to get them even closer to the eruption, which the Ozerian had strictly refused. This was just close enough to the dangerous molten rock, thank you very much. The Ozerians were a perfectly rational species. Watching the silly primates do their silly primate things left Fystories thinking about their galactic neighbors and their seemingly infinite desire to rush into danger. The raptor had recently done some research on the Terrans, and this kind of behavior, of flocking across the distance of space to go visiting erupting volcanoes in person, wasn't even in the top 10 dangerous things they did. Their entire planet was one of danger, yet they took every opportunity to place themselves in harm's way. Earth has been entirely explored and mapped out, able to be explored within computer simulations, yet thousands of Terrans still took the time to climb mountains, dive the deepest oceans, explore caves, or occasionally do all three at the same time. Their excessive weather conditions sounded like something out of a horror movie to Fystories, yet hundreds of the Terrans called themselves tornado hunters and actively sought out the dangerous meteorological conditions. Fystories didn't get it. Maybe there was something special about actually being there, even if it's already been done before. To witness and experience an event, to reach the top of the mountain yourself, no matter how many others have done it before. Perhaps that was the secret to the Terran success, that desire to be involved, to find new personal experiences no matter how dangerous or strange. Frankly, Fystories would much prefer to experience such dangers from the comfort of his bed. The Ozerians were a perfectly rational species after all. If you love engaging stories like this, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay updated with all the latest episodes from FY Stories.